The blood hit the floor before anyone moved. A man's chest tore open in the middle of Hargrove Memorial's ER, and every physician in the room went still, frozen by the kind of wound that doesn't follow textbook patterns, the kind that kills in under 4 minutes if you hesitate. Dr. Raymond Holt stood with his hands raised, not touching the patient, not speaking. The monitor screamed. The room smelled like iron and shock. Then a nurse nobody respected dropped to her knees beside the gurney. She didn't ask permission. She didn't explain herself. Her hands moved with the kind of efficiency that doesn't come from a hospital. It comes from somewhere louder, somewhere bloodier, somewhere most people in that room had never been. Nobody knew yet, but they were about to find out exactly who they had been dismissing. If this story has you gripping your seat already, follow my channel, hit like, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go. The day had started with a complaint. That was how most of Nora Voss's mornings began at Hargrove Memorial Hospital in Caldwell, Montana. Not with coffee going cold at the nurse's station, not with a pre-shift rundown from the outgoing team, but with a printout slid under her locker door, typed in the crisp institutional font of an HR form. Another formal grievance, this one filed by Dr. Raymond Holt, citing what he called disruptive conduct inconsistent with patient care standards. Nora read it twice, folded it in half, and put it in her scrub pocket. She'd been collecting these for 7 months. She was 28 years old, 5'6", with brown hair she kept pulled back tight enough that the night shift techs called her no nonsense when they thought she couldn't hear them. She had a small scar along her left jawline that she never explained, and a stillness to her body even in crowded rooms that some people found reassuring and others found unsettling. She had been hired at Hargrove 14 months ago on the strength of a resume that listed years of nursing experience with a conspicuous gap that she described during her interview as transitional. The panel hadn't pushed. She hadn't offered more. That was the arrangement. Hargrove Memorial was a mid-size hospital with a reputation it was actively trying to rebuild after a series of administrative scandals that had cost the facility 2 department heads and a chunk of its state funding. The new director of clinical operations, a man named Douglas Farron, had come in 18 months earlier promising a culture of accountability and evidence-based leadership. In practice, what that meant was that the physicians he'd inherited from the previous regime kept their positions. The complaint system was used selectively, and anyone who created friction for the senior medical staff found themselves buried in paperwork. Nora created friction. She couldn't seem to stop. It wasn't that she was combative. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't argue in hallways or send inflammatory emails. What she did was document things, quietly, precisely, in a way that left no room for interpretation. When a medication dose got transcribed incorrectly at 2 a.m., Nora flagged it and filed a report. When a post-op patient's pain scores were being misrecorded to inflate satisfaction metrics, she noted the discrepancy in the chart and copied the charge nurse. When a physician ordered imaging on a patient who clearly needed immediate intervention rather than diagnostics, she said so, once, clearly, to the physician directly. That was the one that had started the war with Raymond Holt. Dr. Holt was 44, a trauma surgeon who had been at Hargrove for 11 years and treated the hospital like personal territory. He was technically competent. Nora had never disputed that. But he was also the kind of physician who confused confidence with infallibility and who responded to any questioning of his clinical decisions with the quiet, institutional violence of paperwork. He had filed 3 of the 8 complaints currently stacked in Nora's HR file. The charge nurse, a woman named Sandra Pruitt, had filed 2 more. Pruitt ran the ER floor with the kind of bureaucratic precision that had nothing to do with patient outcomes and everything to do with hierarchy. She was 51, had been at Hargrove for 19 years, and had cultivated a reputation for tight ship running that was really just a reputation for making sure the right people never got their authority questioned. She had taken a disliking to Nora within the first month, the exact moment Nora had rerouted a patient flow issue during a mass intake event without waiting for approval, and had been methodical about it ever since. By the time Nora reached the nurse's station at the start of her shift that Thursday morning, Pruitt was already waiting. "Voss?" Pruitt set down a coffee mug she wasn't drinking from. "Before you clock in, Director Farron wants to see you at 9. I clock in at 7. I know when you clock in." Nora looked at her for a moment. Is this about the Holt complaint? It's about several things. Pruitt's voice was completely flat. Conference room B, 9 o'clock. The shift started like every other shift. 4 patients already waiting, 2 ambulances inbound, the kind of controlled chaos that Hargrove's ER ran on. Nora moved through the floor with the efficiency that had made her good at this job and unpopular with the people who found good inconvenient. She checked in on a chest pain case in Bay 3, caught a charting error on a pediatric patient's antibiotic dose, the second this week from the same resident, and spent 40 minutes with a 60-year-old woman who'd been waiting for 2 hours with a suspected pulmonary embolism and hadn't been triaged above a 3. Nora changed the triage rating, filed the reasoning, moved on. At 8:47, she walked into conference room B. Douglas Farron was already there, seated at the head of the table. He was 55, silver-haired, with the kind of measured effect that made it impossible to read whether he was genuinely listening or had already made his decision before she sat down. Sandra Pruitt sat to his left. There was a woman from HR named Deborah Finch, whom Nora recognized from her original onboarding paperwork. There was no chair pulled out for Nora. She pulled one out herself. Ms. Voss, Farron began, folding his hands on the table. Thank you for making time. You asked me to be here. A brief pause. Yes. We have some concerns we need to address. The concerns, as he laid them out over the next 12 minutes, were familiar. A pattern of insubordination. Repeated failure to observe chain of command protocols. Creating unnecessary conflict with senior medical staff. Undermining physician authority in clinical settings. He used the word disruptive 4 times. He never once mentioned a patient by name. Nora let him finish. The triage reclassification I made 2 weeks ago, she said when he stopped. Mrs. Alvarez, suspected PE. She was discharged from the ICU 4 days later. She would have been dead by noon if she'd stayed at a 3. That's not the point being raised. The charting error I reported on Tuesday. A 7-year-old's amoxicillin dose was entered at 3 times the correct amount. I caught it before administration. Ms. Voss, the complaints Dr. Holt has filed describe me as overstepping. In each instance, I can document, with timestamps and chart records, that what I did was identify a patient safety issue and act on it within my scope. She kept her voice even. Not aggressive, just clear. I'd like to understand what the standard of care expectation is here, specifically because if the expectation is that I observe a correctable error and wait for a physician to notice it, that's not a standard I'm able to meet. Farron looked at Pruitt. Pruitt's expression didn't change. We're not disputing your technical competence, Farron said carefully. This is about conduct and institutional culture. Institutional culture, Nora repeated. Yes. She had known when she walked into this room what the meeting was. She had known it the way you learn to read a situation when you've been trained to read terrain, not with alarm, but with the flat functional recognition that the ground has shifted and you need to adjust accordingly. Am I being suspended? She asked. Farron looked uncomfortable. Effective today, pending a formal review, we're placing you on administrative leave. With pay, for now. He slid a single sheet across the table. Your access badge will be collected at the door. Nora looked at the sheet. She didn't pick it up. I want to be clear about something, she said. Whatever this review finds, the documentation I've filed is accurate. Every report, every timestamp, every clinical note. I kept copies. She stood, pushed in her chair. I'll be available if the review committee has questions. She walked out of conference room B, down the corridor, and handed her badge to a security officer named Marcus, who looked like he wished he was anywhere else. He mumbled an apology. She told him it was fine. It wasn't his fault. She walked to her car in the staff lot, sat in the driver's seat, and didn't move for about 3 minutes. Then she started the engine. She had driven 4 blocks from the hospital when her phone rang. Unknown number, Montana area code. She almost let it go to voicemail. She didn't. Voss, she answered. A pause. Then a man's voice. Not young, measured. The particular flatness of someone who had spent years in environments where unnecessary words were a liability. This is Sergeant First Class Dwayne Okafor, Fort Callum Coordination Office. Is this Nora Voss, formerly with the 68th Medical Brigade out of Fort Bragg? She held the phone very still against her ear. "Who are you?" "I'm not at liberty to discuss specifics on an open line, Ms. Voss, but there's a situation developing at Hargrove Memorial that we've been asked to support, and your name came up in connection with it." Another pause. "I wanted to make contact before things move quickly." "What kind of situation?" "Medical. Trauma. The kind that doesn't wait for paperwork." His voice shifted just slightly. "We have assets inbound to Caldwell. Estimated arrival, 40 minutes. She stared at the windshield, at the gray Montana sky above the intersection ahead of her. "I'm on administrative leave," she said. "I'm aware." "Then I'm not sure what you think I can—" "Ms. Voss." His voice was quiet now, but there was something behind it that stopped her from finishing the sentence. 40 minutes. The line went dead. Nora sat for another long moment, then she put the car in reverse and headed back to Hargrove Memorial. She didn't know why. That wasn't quite true. She knew exactly why. She just hadn't decided yet whether that was a good reason. It turned out to be irrelevant. She was still in the parking lot when the sound hit. A low, rhythmic percussion building from the north, the specific frequency of rotor blades that she recognized before she consciously identified it. Military helicopter. Not what Pochet, too. The sound filled the air above Caldwell's modest skyline, and several people in the parking lot looked up, shielding their eyes. Nora was already out of the car, walking toward the ER entrance. The sliding doors opened into controlled chaos. 3 trauma staff had gathered near the ambulance bay. Pruitt was on the radio. Holt had materialized from somewhere and was pulling on a second pair of gloves, the posture of a man who wanted to be seen responding. Nora stopped at the edge of the bay, outside the doors, still technically off hospital property. The helicopters descended toward the pad on the building's north side. One landed cleanly, the second circled once and then came down fast. The kind of approach that meant they were burning time they didn't have. The gurney came through the doors at speed, pushed by 2 men in tactical gear who moved with the contained urgency of people who had been in situations where the alternative to moving fast was a body bag. The patient was a man in his 30s, military build, tourniquets on his right leg, a chest seal on the left side of his thorax, and a blood pressure reading being called out by a medic alongside the gurney that made Holt's expression go tight. 62 over palp, GCS 12, tension pneumo suspected, chest seal placed in the field. "Bay 1, Holt said, already moving. "Get me imaging, chest x-ray, full trauma panel." "There's no time for imaging." The voice was Nora's. She didn't plan it. It came out the way things came out when the instinct was faster than the decision, clean and certain and too loud to ignore. She was standing in the doorway of the ambulance bay, still technically not badged in, still technically suspended, and every head in the room turned to look at her. Holt turned last. His expression moved through surprise and then settled into something colder. "Ms. Voss, you need to—" His breath sounds are unequal. Left side is absent. She walked toward the gurney because she couldn't not walk toward it. "The seal held in transport, but the tension is rebuilding. You order imaging, he dies on the table before you get the film back." "I am the attending physician, then act like one." The words came out flat and direct. Not cruel, just stripped of anything that wasn't the immediate fact. "Needle decompression. Second intercostal, midclavicular. Right now." The room was so quiet that the monitor alarm seemed twice as loud. The medic who had come in with the gurney, a young woman, early 20s, with Fort Callum patches on her sleeve, looked at the patient, looked at Holt, and then looked at Nora with an expression that was both desperate and assessing. "Her read is right," the medic said, quietly but clearly. His trachea shifted in transport. "We compensated, but I am not taking clinical direction from a suspended staff member," Holt said. "Then take it from her," Nora said, nodding at the field medic. "She's been with him since exfil. She knows this presentation." Something happened in the room, a kind of collective breath hold. The entire trauma team waiting on Holt in a way that exposed exactly how much of their confidence in him was conditional. Holt looked at the patient. He looked at the monitor. He looked at the oxygen saturation dropping in real time across the screen. He reached for the needle. What happened over the next 11 minutes was not elegant. It was not clean. The decompression released a rush of air that confirmed what Nora had identified. The patient's oxygen stats began to climb. A chest tube went in, and the field medic and Nora established a working rhythm on opposite sides of the gurneys, moving the same way, adjusting the same instincts, the unconscious fluency of people trained in the same brutal school, even if they'd never met. Holt worked. He was good when he worked. She'd always known that. But she had been the one to clear the path for him to work, and everyone in Bay 1 had watched it happen. The patient stabilized enough to move to surgical prep at the 22-minute mark. Nora stepped back from the gurney. Her hands were gloved and had been long enough that she'd stopped noticing. She became aware, in the sudden decompression of the room's tension, that there was blood on her forearms, and that she had no badge, and that Sandra Pruitt was standing at the bay entrance staring at her with an expression Nora couldn't entirely read. The field medic pulled off her gloves and looked at Nora. "You've done this before," she said. Not a question. "I've seen it a few times." "In a hospital?" Nora didn't answer that. From the corridor that connected the trauma bay to the main hospital entrance, a different set of footsteps approached. Heavier, deliberate. The particular cadence of someone who was accustomed to people getting out of the way. A man appeared in the doorway. Large frame, late 40s. Wearing the kind of tactical dress uniform that announced command rank before you read the insignia. He surveyed the bay in about 2 seconds, his eyes moving the way experienced people's eyes move, cataloging, assessing, landing last on Nora. He looked at her for a long moment. "You the civilian nurse, like?" he asked. "I was," Nora said. "As of this morning, I'm apparently just a civilian." He looked at the patient being transferred. He looked at the field medic, who gave him a small nod. He looked back at Nora. "What's your background?" he asked. "ER nursing, 14 months here." "Before that?" She held his gaze. "Transitional period." He didn't smile exactly, but something shifted in his face. The microscopic recognition of a particular kind of answer from a particular kind of person. "Captain Marcus Webb," he said. "Special Operations Medical Support, Fort Callum." He didn't extend his hand. Neither did she. "The medic who came in with my soldier, Corporal Tess Arden, she's been in the field for 2 years. She doesn't defer to civilians." She deferred to the correct read, Nora said. "Yes." He paused. "She did." From somewhere behind her, Nora heard Pruitt's voice saying something about unauthorized access to patient care areas, something about liability, something about the review process. She heard it the way you hear background noise in a building you're about to leave. Present, but not relevant. Webb looked past her briefly, in Pruitt's direction, and then back. "We're going to need to talk," he said. "I'm available," Nora said. "I don't apparently have a job to get back to." His eyes moved to her jawline, so the scar for just a half second, and then returned to her face with the careful neutrality of someone filing information away. "Stay close," he said. "Don't leave the building." He turned and walked toward the corridor where his people had taken the patient. Nora stood in the middle of the trauma bay with no badge, no authority, and blood that wasn't hers drying on the back of her hands. Pruitt was already on the phone. Holt had disappeared into the surgical wing without looking back at her. Across the bay, the young field medic, Corporal Arden, was watching Nora with a look that was impossible to pin down. Not suspicion, not gratitude exactly. Something that sat between recognition and question. The expression of someone who has seen a thing they can't explain and knows that whatever explanation exists, it matters. Nora reached for the nearest sink and began washing her hands with the methodical thoroughness of someone who had been taught exactly how to do it and had done it 10,000 times in places that made this trauma bay look like a rest stop. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. Text from the unknown number. The one she now knew belonged to Sergeant First Class Okafor. "We have the file. Do not speak to hospital administration before speaking to us." She read it twice. Dried her hands. From the surgical wing came the sound of controlled activity. Voices, equipment, the particular organized urgency of a team that had found their footing. The soldier Webb had brought in was still alive. That much was certain. What was less certain, what Nora could feel shifting beneath the surface of this morning like ground before an earthquake, was what came next. Not for the soldier. For her. For the file Okafor mentioned that she had never told anyone at Hargrove existed. She had come back to this hospital 12 minutes ago on pure instinct, on the particular pull that happens when training overrides conscious decision-making. She had walked into a room where she had no standing and done the one thing she'd spent 14 months trying to do quietly, invisibly, without drawing attention to exactly this, to the gap in her resume, to the scar, to the way she moved in a trauma bay like someone who had learned it under conditions no civilian hospital could replicate. She had failed at invisible. Somewhere above the hospital, she could hear the second helicopter still running, idling, not powering down, as though whoever had ordered it here had decided the situation was not yet resolved enough to stand down. Nora looked at her clean hands. She thought about the soldier who'd come in with 62 over palp and was now, because of 11 minutes of precise work, going to wake up tomorrow. She thought about the file. Then she walked toward the corridor where Captain Webb had disappeared, because that was where the truth was going, and she had never been good at waiting for it to come to her. The corridor smelled like antiseptic and old carpet, the particular combination that every hospital shared regardless of how recently it had been renovated. Nora walked it the way she walked most things, steadily, with her eyes tracking what mattered and letting the rest fall to peripheral. Webb was standing outside a room marked Family Consultation, the kind of euphemistic label hospitals used for spaces where they delivered bad news. He was on a phone call, speaking in the clipped shorthand of someone giving a situation report, and he held up one finger when he saw her without breaking his sentence. She stopped, waited. That was fine. She had learned patience in places where impatience got people killed. He finished the call and pocketed the phone. "My soldier's in surgery, Tuts," he said. "Prognosis is guarded, but they're calling it survivable." He looked at her steadily. "Because of what happened in that bay. Holt did the procedure. After you identified the problem, called the intervention, and overrode his initial order." Webb's voice was matter-of-fact, not combative. "Arden told me what she saw. She's been in 3 combat rotations. She doesn't exaggerate." Nora didn't say anything. "I'm going to ask you something," he said, "and I'd appreciate a straight answer." "I'll try." 68th Medical Brigade, Fort Bragg, 2017 to 2022. He watched her face. "You were assigned as a combat medic on 2 overseas deployments. You received a commendation after the Karif Valley operation. You were medically separated in 2022 following a non-combat injury, and your service record was flagged as distinguished." He paused. "That you?" The fluorescent light above them buzzed faintly. Somewhere down the corridor, a cart wheeled past, someone talking about labs. "Where did you get that?" she asked. "Fort Callum has a coordination office that tracks former 68th personnel. Your name flagged when we got the hospital assignment." He kept his gaze level. "I'm not here to expose anything. I'm asking because what I saw in that bay was not 14 months of ER nursing." "No," she said. "It wasn't." He nodded, just once, like that confirmed something he'd already decided. "Why aren't you using it? The background. You could be practicing at a trauma center with your experience." "I wanted something quieter." "How's that working out?" She looked at him for a moment. Despite herself, something in her face shifted. Not quite a smile, but the ghost of one. "Not great." He didn't smile back, but the tension in his posture eased fractionally. "Sergeant Okafor contacted you this morning. About 40 minutes before you landed. We had intel that this transport was going to a hostile reception point, politically, not physically." He glanced down the corridor. "There are things happening at this hospital that go beyond your suspension, Ms. Voss. Things my office became aware of through a separate channel about 3 weeks ago." Nora went still. Not visibly. She'd learned not to let stillness show. But inside, something recalibrated. "What kind of things?" she asked. "The kind that don't get filed in HR." He pulled a card from his breast pocket and held it out. "I need you to stay available and stay quiet. Don't talk to Farron, don't talk to hospital legal, and do not let them walk you out of the building until Okafor gets here. He's 40 minutes out." She took the card. It had a Fort Callum number and nothing else. "You're asking me to trust you based on about 8 minutes of conversation," she said. I'm asking you to trust the fact that I know who you were before this place got its hands on you, he said. And the way he said it, not unkind, but frank, in the way that people who don't waste words are frank, landed differently than she'd expected. Sometimes that's enough. He walked back toward the surgical wing, and Nora stood in the corridor holding a card with a phone number and the specific feeling of a situation that had stopped being about her a long time ago. She just hadn't known it yet. She went to the staff break room on the second floor because it was the one place in Hargrove where she could sit without someone having jurisdiction over whether she was allowed to be there. She poured coffee she didn't intend to drink and sat at the table farthest from the door and thought about what Webb had said. 3 weeks ago. 3 weeks ago, she had filed a detailed incident report on a patient named Gerald Bowen, a 53-year-old construction worker who had come through the ER twice in 6 weeks with soft tissue injuries consistent with high-impact workplace trauma. The second visit, she had documented his account of the site conditions at a facility called Vantage Industrial Solutions, a manufacturing contractor based outside Caldwell that employed roughly 400 people. Bowen had described conditions that his supervisors called unavoidable. He'd called them ignored. She had included that account in her report. She had also noted that this was the third Vantage employee she'd treated in 4 months with similar injury patterns. The report had gone into the system and, as far as she could tell, had gone nowhere. 2 days later, the first HR complaint from Holt had escalated. She'd connected those dots before. She just hadn't known what to do with the picture they made. The break room door opened and Corporal Tess Arden came in, still in her field uniform, her dark hair pulled back, moving with the careful economy of someone operating on adrenaline already running thin. She looked around the room, found Nora, and sat down across from her without asking. "You don't want to be alone right now," Arden said. Not as an observation, as a fact she had already processed. "I'm fine," Nora said. "Yeah, I can see that." Arden poured herself coffee from the same pot. "How long were you in?" Nora looked at her. "I'm not going to tell anyone," Arden said. "I'm asking because it helps me understand what happened in that bay, and I'd like to understand it because what you did was—" She stopped, seeming to recalibrate. "I've seen field medics with 10 years in freeze-up on presentations like that. You didn't blink." "I blinked," Nora said, "just not where anyone could see it." Arden was quiet for a moment. Then, quietly, 5 years. 68th Medical. Nora looked at her more carefully. "I came up through the 68th, Arden said. Did my first rotation in 2021. She wrapped both hands around the coffee mug. Karif Valley, 2022. I was a first-year corporal. You wouldn't remember me. I was one of about 60 on the ground." The break room felt suddenly smaller. Nora had not thought about Karif Valley in approximately 11 months, because thinking about it served no functional purpose, and she had gotten very good at not doing things that served no functional purpose. But she remembered it the way you remember things that happened in the dark, in the loud. Not sequentially, but in flashes. 12 hours, 4 casualties. 2 of them her patients. One she saved by doing something that wasn't in any field manual, but that her hands knew how to do before her brain caught up. "You were there," she said. "I was there." Arden held her gaze. "I saw what you did for Specialist Harmon. I was the one who called in the second medevac." Nora set down her coffee cup. Neither of them said anything for a moment. "So when Captain Webb says my name flagged at the coordination office," Nora said slowly. "It wasn't just the database," Arden said. "It was me. I told him, when we got the hospital assignment, that if there was a Nora Voss at Hargrove Memorial in Caldwell, Montana, we needed to know what was happening to her before we landed." She paused. "Because the kind of person who does what you did in that valley doesn't end up suspended in a civilian ER by accident." The weight of that sentence settled in the room. "How much does Webb know?" Nora asked. Service record, the commendation, the broad strokes. Arden glanced at the door, then back. "He doesn't know about the Vantage reports. I only found out about those 30 minutes ago from Okafor, but when I heard it," she shook her head. "It fits. It fits the pattern of what they were doing to you." "What pattern?" "Isolating someone before you erase them," Arden said, with the directness of someone who had seen it done. You document something that costs someone money or protection. They bury you in complaints until your credibility is destroyed, and by the time anyone looks at what you originally filed, you're the unreliable one, the troublemaker. Her jaw tightened slightly. It's not an original play. Nora thought about the 8 complaints in her HR file, about the way they had started 2 days after the Bowen report, about the fact that none of them had ever included a patient complaint, not a single one, only physician and administrative staff concerns. Someone at this hospital is protecting Vantage, she said. Okafor thinks so. Webb is going to think so in about 20 minutes when Okafor briefs him. Arden looked at her steadily. The question is what you have and where it is. I kept copies, Nora said. Everything I filed, with timestamps, off-site. For the first time, something that was almost relief crossed Arden's face. Good. The break room door opened. Not slowly. It hit the stop with the particular force of someone who hadn't bothered to moderate their approach. Sandra Pruitt stood in the doorway with Douglas Farron behind her, and a man in a suit that Nora did not recognize beside him. Pruitt looked at Nora, then at Arden, then back at Nora. Ms. Voss, Farron said. His voice had changed from the conference room version, tighter, with an edge that hadn't been there before. I need you to come with us. We have security ready to escort you from the premises. I was told to stay in the building, Nora said. By whom? Captain Webb. Something moved across Farron's face. Not quite fear. Something adjacent to it. The particular discomfort of someone who has just realized that a situation they thought they controlled has a variable they didn't account for. The suited man stepped forward. He was 50 or so, gray at the temples, with the kind of deliberately forgettable face that some lawyers cultivate professionally. Miss Voss, I'm Gareth Lowe, representing hospital administration. You're currently on administrative suspension, and your presence in this facility is at the discretion of management. We're requesting that you leave voluntarily. And if I don't, Nora asked, then security will assist you. Arden had not moved from her chair. She was watching Lowe with a careful, unreadable attention. Your hospital counsel? She asked him. Lowe looked at her, at the uniform, the rank insignia, and his expression adjusted slightly. That's correct. So you're aware that we transported a critically injured active-duty U.S. military personnel to this facility approximately 90 minutes ago, Arden said, and that Ms. Voss was directly involved in the initial stabilization of that patient. I'm aware of the situation, yes. Then you're also aware that removing a material witness to a military medical transport before the coordinating officer from Fort Callum has completed his on-site assessment would be... She tilted her head, just slightly. Complicated. Lowe looked at Farron. Farron looked at Nora. Nora looked at nobody in particular. She picked up her coffee cup, which she had never been drinking, and set it on the counter beside the sink. I'll wait for Captain Webb, she said. The silence in the break room lasted about 4 seconds. Then Farron said something quiet to Lowe. Lowe said something quiet back, and Pruitt, who had not said anything at all since walking in, looked at Nora with an expression that had moved past professional disapproval into something Nora recognized as the specific look of someone realizing they may have miscalculated. They left. The door closed behind them. Arden let out a slow breath. You do that well, Nora said. What? The implication without the explicit claim. Arden looked at her mug. My father was a defense attorney. I learned to talk around corners before I learned to shoot. They sat in the quiet for a moment. Down the hall, muffled sounds. The hospital running its ordinary machinery around an extraordinary situation. Nora's phone buzzed. A number she didn't recognize. Different from Okafor's. Different from Webb's. A 703 area code that she placed as Northern Virginia before she finished reading it. She answered. Ms. Voss, a woman's voice, crisp, not unkind. This is Major Renata Flood, Office of the Inspector General, Department of Defense. We've been made aware of your situation at Hargrove Memorial. I'd like to speak with you about a matter adjacent to your service record. Nora looked at Arden, who was watching her with an expression that said she could tell from one side of the conversation that something significant had just shifted. I'm available, Nora said. Good. A brief pause, the sound of papers or a keyboard. We've been conducting an independent review of procurement and contractor conduct in medical facilities with military transit agreements for the past 4 months. Hargrove Memorial is on that list. Another pause. Your documentation has been reviewed, all of it. Nora sat down slowly. We'd like you to be available for a formal interview in approximately 72 hours, Major Flood said. In the meantime, do not sign or agree to anything from hospital administration or their legal representative. Do not surrender any personal documentation, and do not, under any circumstances, allow them to walk you out of the building under a termination notice before Sergeant Okafor arrives. He's 20 minutes out, Nora said. I know, Flood said. We've been tracking his ETA. The line ended. Nora held the phone in her hand and looked at the wall of the Hargrove Memorial break room, at the corkboard with the shift swap requests and the wellness flyer and the faded printout of last month's birthday list, and understood, with a clarity that arrived all at once rather than in pieces, that the thing she had spent 14 months trying to hold together quietly was not just her career or her cover or her sense of forward motion. It was evidence. She had been building evidence without knowing she was building it, and somewhere above this hospital, at a level she had not known was watching, someone had been waiting for it to be complete enough to use. Her hands were steady. They'd been steady in Kharif Valley when they shouldn't have been. They were steady now. What was not steady? What she could feel moving beneath everything with the particular instability of ground that has been undermined was the hospital itself. Because whatever Flood and Okafor and Webb had, it was bigger than Sandra Pruitt's complaints, and bigger than Douglas Farron's political maneuvering, and whoever had put Gareth Lowe in a suit and sent him to that break room to walk her out had done it because they knew it too. The door to the break room opened again. This time it was Marcus, the security officer. He looked at her with the same apologetic expression he'd worn when he took her badge. Ms. Voss, he said, there's someone at the main entrance asking for you, military. Says his name is Okafor. He glanced over his shoulder. And there's, Ms. Voss, there are 2 black SUVs in the parking lot with federal plates, and Mr. Farron is on the phone with someone, and I don't... He stopped, steadied himself. I just thought you should know what you're walking into. Nora stood. Thank you, Marcus, she said. She meant it. She walked to the door and then stopped, turned back to where Arden was rising from the table. Arden, she said, whatever's in those SUVs... I know, Arden said. I already texted Webb. Nora nodded once. Then she walked out into the corridor, toward the main entrance of Hargrove Memorial Hospital, toward Okafor and the federal plates and whatever had been set in motion long before this morning. And the thought that moved through her as she walked was not fear and it was not relief. It was the particular cold focus of someone who has just realized the operation has not ended. It has only just reached the phase where the real work begins. Okafor was exactly what his voice had suggested, broad-shouldered, mid-40s, with the particular stillness of someone who had learned to conserve everything, including expression. He was standing at the main entrance in civilian clothes that somehow still read as military, a laptop bag over one shoulder and a manila folder under his arm, and when Nora came through the corridor doors, he looked at her the way Webb had looked at her, assessing, confirming, filing. Voss, he said. Okafor? He didn't extend his hand either. She was starting to think this was a Fort Callum thing. Walk with me, he said. Not toward administration, toward the East Wing. They moved. Behind her she could hear the lobby. Voices elevated slightly, the particular acoustics of an institutional space where people were trying to have tense conversations quietly and failing. She didn't look back. The SUVs, she said, 2 agents from the Inspector General's office and 1 from the Department of Labor's Wage and Hour Division. He kept his voice level, barely above a murmur. The labor agent has been working the Vantage industrial file for 9 weeks. The IG team came on 4 weeks ago when the military transit agreement flagged. Major Flood called me. I know, she told me. He glanced sideways at her. You kept physical copies. Offsite, a storage unit I rent under a different address. 11 months of documentation, incident reports, chart discrepancies, the Vantage employee accounts, timestamps for every complaint filed against me cross-referenced with the dates of my Vantage-related filings. Something shifted in Okafor's posture. Subtle, but she caught it. Satisfaction, maybe. or the relief of a variable that had been uncertain becoming certain. "There's a name we need you to confirm," he said. He opened the manila folder without stopping, held it at an angle so she could see the single sheet inside. A photograph. Hospital ID photo, the kind taken at orientation. Bright background, institutional crop. A man in his early 60s with silver hair and a careful, managed smile. She looked at it for 3 seconds. "Harlan Price," she said. "Chief of Hospital Operations. He's been here longer than Farron, 22 years. He handles the facility contracts, including the Vantage contract." "I didn't know there was a Vantage contract, not specifically." She thought back. "I knew the workers were coming here. I assumed because we were the nearest Level 3 facility to their site." "There's a preferential routing agreement," Okafor said. "Vantage employees with workplace injuries get directed to Hargrove as a first point of care regardless of injury severity. In exchange, Hargrove receives a facilities grant from Vantage's parent company that accounts for about 8% of their annual operating budget." He paused, letting that settle. "The grant has a clause. Adverse documentation of workplace injury patterns, documentation that could be used in regulatory complaints or litigation, voids the grant." Nora stopped walking. Okafor took 2 more steps and stopped too, turning back to look at her. "They were protecting the grant," she said. "Price was. We believe Farron knew the broad outlines. Pruitt was operational. She's the one who escalated the complaints and coordinated with Holt. Holt may have understood more than he's admitted, or he may have simply been useful. We're still working that piece." The East Wing corridor was quieter than the main building. Outpatient offices, a rehabilitation gym, administrative storage. Their footsteps on the linoleum were too loud for the conversation they were having. "Price knew what I was filing," Nora said. It wasn't a question. She was working it out as she said it. "The Bowen report specifically. Bowen described the site conditions in enough detail that a regulatory agency could have opened an inspection. A OSHA complaint was already pending from a different worker. Your documentation would have corroborated it and likely triggered a formal investigation." He closed the folder. "Instead, within 48 hours of your report, the complaint chain against you accelerated. Pruitt filed, Holt filed, and Price drafted a memorandum to Farron recommending your termination for cause." "A memorandum I was never shown." "No, you wouldn't have been." He tucked the folder back under his arm. "Price has been doing this for at least 6 years, Voss. You're not the first person they moved against. You're the first one who documented it well enough that the documentation survived." She thought about that, about the nurses and residents who had come and gone during her 14 months at Hargrove, people who had seemed competent, who had seemed like they might push back, who had then quietly disappeared from the schedule. She had noticed it without registering it as a pattern. She registered it now. "Price is in the building?" she asked. "3rd floor, his office. He doesn't know the SUVs are federal." Okafor almost smiled. "He thinks it's related to the military transport. He's been on the phone with Lowe for the last 20 minutes. "And Farron?" "Farron knows something is wrong, but doesn't know how wrong." He looked at her steadily. "The IG agents are going to want to speak with you in the next hour. Webb is going to be in that meeting. So is a representative from the State Medical Board who drove up from Helena this morning." "The State Medical Board," she repeated. "The falsification of clinical records. Your incident report about the post-op satisfaction metrics, the one Pruitt tried to reclassify as an interpersonal complaint, that triggered a separate track." He paused. "This has more threads than you knew you were pulling." She had gone very still again, not with fear, with the particular cognitive load of integrating a picture that was larger than the frame she'd been looking through. "I need to get the copies," she said. "Arden is already coordinating transportation. We'll need you to retrieve them personally, chain of custody." He started walking again. "But first, the IG team wants a preliminary conversation. 20 minutes. Conference room." "Not conference room B," she said. He glanced at her. "No, we're using the surgical family consultation room. Webb cleared it." They turned the corner into the East Wing's small lobby, and Nora saw Webb through the glass partition of the consultation room. Standing, not sitting, with 2 people she didn't know who carried the specific energy of federal agents, composed, watchful, occupying space efficiently. A woman with a state ID lanyard stood near the window, looking at something on a tablet. Nora pushed open the door. What followed was not the tense interrogation she might have expected. It was methodical. The IG agent, a compact man named Vera, who spoke in complete sentences and took no visible notes because he was recording on a device on the table, walked her through a timeline. He asked about specific dates, specific reports. He asked her to describe in order every interaction with Pruitt that had followed a clinical documentation filing. He asked about Harlan Price, when she'd first interacted with him, what the nature of those interactions had been, whether he had ever directly referenced the Vantage employees in her presence. He had. Once. 4 months ago, in a hallway conversation that had lasted less than 2 minutes, Price had told her that the hospital took its relationships with regional employers seriously, and that her documentation practices were creating unnecessary friction. She had not understood it at the time as a threat. "Did you document that conversation?" Vera asked. "Yes. Same day. It's in the storage unit." He looked at his colleague, a woman named Park, who had said almost nothing and whose stillness made Nora instinctively trust her more than people who performed engagement. Park gave a small nod. Webb, from his position near the wall, said, "The medical board rep needs 5 minutes before we move." The woman with the tablet came forward. Her name was Dr. Sylvia Orent, State Medical Board, Clinical Compliance Division. She was 60, sharp-eyed, with reading glasses pushed up on her forehead that she kept forgetting about. She asked Nora 4 specific questions about the post-op metric manipulation, the mechanism, the timing, who had access to the system, whether she had observed Holt specifically altering records, or whether she had inferred it from timestamp discrepancies. "Both," Nora said. "I saw a record in the system with a modification timestamp at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday." Holt's case. "The original entry was mine from 4:30 that afternoon. The pain scores changed. I screenshotted it before I filed the report." Orent took her glasses off her forehead. "You have the screenshot." "In the storage unit." Orent looked at Webb. Webb looked at Okafor. "We need those copies in the next 2 hours," Vera said, "before administration has time to file anything that could create a procedural obstacle." "I can leave now," Nora said. "Arden will go with you," Webb said. "2 of my people outside." It was almost orderly, almost manageable, the controlled energy of a plan executing against resistance. And then Nora's phone rang. She looked at the screen. A Hargrove extension she didn't recognize. She looked at Webb, who gave a slight nod. She answered on speaker. "Ms. Voss?" The voice was Harlan Price, and she recognized it immediately, not just because she'd heard it before, but because it had a specific quality now. The over-measured cadence of someone who had prepared what they were going to say and was performing calm. "I understand there's been some confusion today regarding your employment status. I'd like to speak with you directly, in my office, to discuss a possible resolution." The room was silent. Vera had his hand near the recording device but did not move. "What kind of resolution?" Nora asked. "An administrative one? I believe there may have been some procedural missteps that we'd like to address before they become unnecessarily complicated." A breath. "I also want to discuss your documentation, your personal copies of hospital files. I understand you've retained some materials that technically belong to the institution." There it was. Someone had told him she had copies in the last 20 minutes, which meant someone in or near this conversation, or adjacent to it, had communicated that upward. She looked at Vera. He was already writing something on a notepad, actual paper, quick strokes. "I'm available to meet," Nora said. "Give me 30 minutes." "Of course." Price's voice smoothed. "Come up when you're ready." She ended the call. "He knows about the copies," she said. "Not what's in them," Park said for the first time. Her voice was even, precise. "Or he'd be doing something other than inviting you upstairs for a chat." She looked at Vera. "He wants to make an offer, something to get her to surrender the documentation voluntarily. Or confirm what she has before he tries another angle," Vera said. "Either way, we have a problem," Webb said. "If he suspects the storage unit, he doesn't have an address," Nora said. "It's not in anything I filed with the hospital. It's not connected to my name officially." She paused. But if he talks to Lowe and Lowe talks to whoever they have watching my personal records, we have 40 minutes, Okafor said. Maybe 50. The room recalibrated. Fast, wordless, the way groups of competent people shift when a timeline compresses. Arden appeared in the doorway. She'd left the break room ahead of Nora and had evidently been outside the consultation room long enough to track the essential shape of things. She looked at Webb. "Vehicle is ready," she said. "Go," Webb told Nora. "Arden drives. My two outside go with you. Do not stop for anything." Nora picked up her jacket from the chair. She was almost at the door when Orant said, "Ms. Voss." She turned. Orant had her glasses in her hand, turning them by the earpiece. She had the look of someone choosing words carefully, not out of evasion, but out of precision. "The record hold altered," she said. "If your screenshot shows what you say, it shows. That is a Class B clinical data falsification under Montana State Code. That is not a board reprimand situation." She paused. "That is a license situation." Nora held her gaze. "I know." "Good," Orant said. "Get the copies." The storage unit was 11 minutes from the hospital in a facility on the eastern edge of Caldwell, the kind of place that rented by the month to people who needed to keep things they couldn't explain at home and didn't want to explain to anyone. Nora had rented the unit 9 months ago under a name variant she was legally entitled to use. Nora E. Voss rather than Nora Ellen Voss, a minor distinction that created enough separation for her purposes. Arden drove without speaking for the first 4 minutes, which Nora appreciated. The two Fort Callum personnel in the vehicle behind them stayed at a consistent distance, professional, unobtrusive. "Price called me," Nora said, when the silence had settled into something comfortable enough to break. "I heard." Arden kept her eyes on the road. Webb flagged it immediately. Someone inside leaked. "Has to be Lowe or Pruitt." Pruitt had access to the break room conversation, or close enough. Nora watched the Montana flatland moving past the window. "She didn't hear everything. She heard enough." "Does it change what's in the storage unit?" "No." "Then it doesn't change anything." They pulled into the facility. The gate required a code Nora entered from memory. Unit 34, back row, far enough from the office that the cameras had suboptimal angles. She had assessed that before she'd rented it. She opened the padlock with a key she kept on a ring with her car key, and nothing else. Inside, a single plastic tub, sealed, with a combination lock threaded through the handle. Inside that, 11 months of documentation, printed copies of every report, every timestamp log, every screenshot, every chart discrepancy she had flagged and filed. In a separate sealed envelope, the account she had taken from Gerald Bowen, written in his own handwriting at her request, signed and dated, describing the site conditions at Vantage Industrial Solutions in specific enough detail that 3 different regulatory agencies would be able to act on it independently. She had not known, when she asked him to write it, that she was building a case. She had thought she was doing what she always did, making a record, because records were the only thing that survived the version of events that powerful people preferred. Arden looked at the tub. "That's everything?" "That's everything." They loaded it into the vehicle. Nora locked the unit out of habit and then stood for a moment in the flat Montana light, holding the keyring, thinking about the fact that she had kept this place for 9 months, in case she needed it, and had spent 9 months hoping she wouldn't. She got back in the car. They were 4 blocks from Hargrove when Arden's radio crackled. Webb's voice clipped, the economy of someone transmitting under pressure. "Change of approach. Do not come to main entrance. East Wing loading dock. Price went to administration level 4 with Lowe 12 minutes ago. Farron is with them. Building security has been told to watch for your vehicle." Arden didn't react visibly. She took the next left without being asked. "Farron activated building security," Nora said, "which means Price told him enough to make him feel like he had to." Arden's hands were steady on the wheel. "Which means Price is scared." "Scared people make bad decisions." "Exactly." The loading dock was on the hospital's east face, a utilitarian space used for medical supply deliveries, with a roll-up door and a concrete apron and none of the lobby's sight lines. Webb was there with Okafor when they pulled up, and Vera had come down as well, and the expression on Webb's face had tightened in the way that suggested the situation had moved while they were driving. "What happened?" Nora asked, climbing out. "Price accessed the document management system 12 minutes ago," Vera said. "He flagged 4 of your incident reports for administrative review and reclassification. He can't delete them. The system has an audit log. But reclassification changes how they're indexed, which could create a chain of custody argument if we're not ahead of it." "The audit log," Nora said immediately. "Who has access to the audit log?" "Hospital IT and the State Health Information Office, because Hargrove participates in the State Digital Records Exchange." Vera looked at her. "If we request a preservation hold through the state office, it freezes the log as is and prevents any further modification. Can you do that now?" "I'm on the phone with them in about 3 minutes." He was already moving. Okafor took the storage tub from Arden's arms. "We photograph and catalog everything on site. Chain of custody starts the moment we open it." The loading dock became, in the following 22 minutes, the most organized chaos Nora had operated in since a forward operating base in conditions she was not currently thinking about. Park photographed each document as Okafor removed it. Webb logged the sequence. Orant, who had come down the East Wing stairs with her tablet and her reading glasses now actually on her face, reviewed the clinical records in real time with the particular attention of someone who knew exactly what she was looking for. She found the Holt screenshot in the 4th folder. She looked at it for a long time. Then she looked at Nora. "This is unambiguous," she said. "I know. He modified a pain score entry from a 7 to a 2. Your original notation from 4:31 p.m. and his system modification at 11:52 p.m. are both time-stamped on this screenshot." Orant set the page down with the careful deliberateness of someone handling something that had just become significant. He also changed the functional assessment note. Your note indicated the patient was experiencing mobility impairment consistent with undermanaged pain. His modification removed that notation entirely. "Because it would have required a revised care plan," Nora said, "which would have shown up in the outcome metrics as a complication, which would have affected the satisfaction scores they were reporting to the board." Orant removed her glasses. "Doctor, Holt has been on staff here for 11 years. He has a clean record." She said it not as exculpation, but as fact, the weight of what that record was now going to have to absorb. "This will not stay at Hargrove. This goes to the National Practitioner Database." From inside the hospital, somewhere above them, and muffled by concrete and distance, came the sound of elevated voices. Not shouting. The building dampened it too much for that. But the particular acoustic signature of a confrontation happening in an institutional space. Webb stepped away to take a call. 30 seconds. He came back with the tightest expression Nora had seen on him yet. "Price went to the ER," he said. "He's trying to have the patient transfer records amended. He's claiming the military transport documentation needs to be corrected for billing purposes." His jaw was set. He's trying to remove any reference to Nora's involvement in the stabilization. The loading dock went quiet. Not the quiet of people who had run out of things to say. The quiet of people understanding simultaneously what that meant. Not just legally, not just procedurally, but in terms of what kind of person Harlan Price was. A soldier had nearly died, was still in surgery. And Price's first instinct, with federal agents in his building, was to amend the records. "He doesn't know we're down here," Arden said. "No," Webb said. "He thinks Voss is still somewhere in the building waiting to come to his office." He looked at Nora. "We have maybe 10 minutes before someone tells him different." "Is the ER charge nurse on shift right now, Pruitt?" Nora asked. "Yes," Okafor said. "Then she's the one who gives him access to the transport records." Nora thought through it in real time, the procedural chain of who touched what and when. The military transport documentation. That's a joint form. It requires sign-off from both the receiving facility and the transport unit. She looked at Arden. Arden straightened. "The transport documentation has a military copy." "Which is already filed," Nora said, "with Fort Callum, with timestamps that were created before Price touched anything." Something settled in Webb's expression. "He can amend the hospital copy," Vera said slowly, "but he can't amend the military copy. And if the two versions don't match..." Then the discrepancy itself becomes the evidence, Nora said. The loading dock was cold. The Montana air coming off the concrete apron had a bite that the hospital's climate-controlled interior had muted, and Nora was aware of it now in a way she hadn't been minutes ago. Aware of the physical reality of standing in a parking dock with a plastic tub of documentation and the understanding that what Price had just done upstairs had not outmaneuvered them. It had finished him. He just didn't know it yet. Vera's phone rang. He answered, listened for 4 seconds, and said, "Send the hold confirmation to my email." He ended the call and looked up. State Health Information Office has issued the preservation hold. The audit log is frozen as of 8 minutes ago. He looked at the timestamp on his phone, before Price accessed the ER records. Webb said, "I want someone on the ER floor in the next 3 minutes." "I'll go," Arden said. "Take Marcus," Nor said. "The security officer. He's been watching this happen all day and he's not going to interfere. He's also been in that ER long enough that Pruitt won't think twice about him being there." Webb looked at her with an expression that was, for the first time, openly something close to respect. Not the assessed, measured variety, the reflexive kind. The kind that arrives before the person decides to show it. "Go," he said to Arden. Arden went. Okafor handed Nora the folder with Bowen's handwritten account. "This is the piece that connects the clinical falsification to the Vantage contract," he said. "This is the piece that makes it a conspiracy rather than isolated misconduct." She looked at Bowen's handwriting, deliberate, a little uneven, the handwriting of a man who didn't write things down often and had done it carefully because she'd asked him to. "He's going to want to know it worked," she said. "He'll know," Okafor said. "When it's over, he'll know." From inside the hospital, from above them, from the direction of the main administrative wing, came the sound of a door, fast footsteps, and then voices. Not elevated now. Urgent. The particular acoustic signature of people who have just received information that required them to move. Nora looked up at the ceiling of the loading dock as though she could see through it. She couldn't, but she could read the sound well enough. Somewhere on the 4th floor of Hargrove Memorial Hospital, Harlan Price had just been told that the federal agents in the building were not there about the military transport. They were there about him. And the documentation he had spent 7 months trying to destroy was sitting in a plastic tub on the loading dock, fully cataloged, chain of custody intact, in the hands of people who had the authority to use every page of it. Vera looked at Nora. "Ready?" She picked up her jacket. "One more thing," Park said from behind the catalog stack. Her voice was still even, still precise. She was holding a single sheet, one of the HR complaint forms from Nora's file that had been included in the documentation as comparative evidence. She turned it so Nora could see it. It was one of Price's, not filed under his name, filed under Pruitt's, the way they had all been filed. But in the top corner, in the metadata field that most people never checked, was an originating user ID Hargrove Ops Price. He had written the complaints himself, all of them, every single one that Pruitt had submitted under her name. Nora looked at the sheet for a long moment. "He wrote them," she said. "Every word," Park said. "Pruitt's login submitted them. His login authored them." She set the sheet back in the stack. "That's not a procedural violation. That's fraud." The loading dock doors were still open to the Montana air, and somewhere above them, the hospital was rearranging itself around the truth it had been holding at arm's length for years. And the woman it had spent 7 months trying to erase was standing at the center of it. Not with triumph, not with the clean satisfaction of a story resolving neatly, but with the particular weight of someone who had done the unglamorous work of documentation and record-keeping and precise, careful truth-telling in a place that had punished her for it, and was now watching that work become the thing that could not be undone. Her phone buzzed. A text from a number she didn't recognize. Montana area code, not Okafor's, not Webb's. "This is Gerald Bowen. Someone told me federal agents are at Hargrove today. Is it about what I told you?" She looked at the message for a moment. Then she typed back. "Yes. Your account is part of the record. You did the right thing." She pocketed the phone. Vera said, "We need to go up." They went. And as the elevator doors closed on the loading dock level and began to carry them upward toward the fourth floor of Hargrove Memorial Hospital, toward Harlan Price and Douglas Farron and Gareth Lowe, and the specific reckoning that had been building since the morning Nora Voss first filed a report that someone powerful had decided they could not afford to let stand, Okafor looked at her once, a quick sidelong assessment. "You doing all right?" he asked. It was the first time anyone had asked her that today. She considered the question with the honesty it deserved. "Ask me in an hour," she said. The elevator doors opened on 4, and the first thing Nora saw was Sandra Pruitt standing in the corridor outside the administrative suite with the expression of someone who has just understood, completely and irreversibly, that the position they were standing in yesterday no longer exists. And behind Pruitt, through the glass wall of the conference room, Harlan Price was sitting at the table with his phone in his hand and his face the color of old concrete, and across from him, already seated, already opening a folder, was a woman in a suit that Nora had never seen before, with a federal credential on a lanyard, and the particular stillness of someone who has been waiting a long time for this exact meeting and intends to make every second of it count. The woman in the suit didn't look up when the elevator doors opened. She was already talking, not loudly, not with any theatrical gravity, just steadily, the way people talk when they have more material than time and intend to use both efficiently. Her credential lanyard read DOJ-OIG, in letters large enough to read from the elevator. A second person sat beside her, a man with a state seal on his badge holder and a laptop open in front of him, typing with the focused economy of someone capturing every word. Price was looking at the folder she had placed in front of him. He was not looking at it the way people look at documents they intend to contest. He was looking at it the way people look at things they recognize, the specific, involuntary recognition of someone seeing their own choices reflected back at them in official formatting. Nora stepped out of the elevator. Okafor and Vieira moved with her. Park stayed near the elevator bank, which Nora understood without being told. She was watching the floor, the exits, the way people positioned themselves when they understood something was closing around them. Pruitt was still in the corridor. Up close, she looked diminished, not physically, but in the way that some people diminish when the structure they've been standing on turns out to have been borrowed from someone else. She looked at Nora with an expression that had shed its professional flatness and was now just something raw and unmanaged, caught between the impulse to speak and the belated recognition that speaking was the worst possible decision. She didn't speak. Nora walked past her. Through the glass wall, the DOJ agent, her lanyard also read a name, Carver, had placed a second document on the table. Price's attorney, Lowe, was leaning over it with his reading glasses on, and even from the corridor, Nora could read the particular posture of a lawyer encountering something he had not been prepared to encounter. The slight forward hunch, the stillness of the hands, the fractional pause before the next breath. Farron was at the far end of the table. He had the look of a man who had understood, sometime in the last 30 minutes, that he had boarded a vehicle whose destination he'd never actually confirmed. He was watching Price with the specific wariness of someone recalculating how close they had been sitting to the problem. Webb pushed open the conference room door. Carver looked up. She took in Webb's uniform, Okafor, Nora, Vieira with his recorder, and the storage tub in Okafor's arms, and said nothing for about 2 seconds, the professional pause of someone integrating new information without interrupting their own momentum. "Captain," she said to Webb, "good timing." "We have the physical documentation," Webb said. "Chain of custody is complete." Carver looked at Price. "Mr. Price, the documentation Ms. Voss maintained off-site has been recovered and cataloged. A preservation hold was issued on Hargrove Memorial's digital records management system at 11:34 this morning prior to your access of the ER transport records at 11:41. She closed the folder she had been working from. "I want to make sure you understand what that sequencing means." Price's attorney put a hand on his arm. Price said, "I'd like to take a brief recess." "We're not in a proceeding, Mr. Price," Carver said. "This is an interview. You're not compelled to participate. But the investigation continues regardless." She looked at him with an expression that was not unkind and not warm. Precise. The way a scalpel is precise. "The question is whether you'd like your cooperation on record before the next phase or after." Lowe leaned close to Price and said something inaudible. Price looked at the table. He was 63 years old and had spent 22 years at Hargrove Memorial, long enough to have watched the hospital change directors twice, to have outlasted 3 rounds of accreditation reviews, to have built a network of dependencies that he had probably believed made him immovable. The look on his face was not the look of someone still calculating. It was the look of someone whose calculation had finished and returned a number they weren't prepared for. He didn't speak. Nora stood at the back of the room and let the room do what the room was doing. She had no authority here in any official capacity. She had no badge, no current hospital standing, no formal role in whatever Carver was building toward. What she had was the tub Okafor was setting on the credenza, and the 11 months of documentation inside it, and the understanding, arriving quietly, the way things arrive when you've been too close to them to see the shape, that this was what she had been doing all along, not surviving, not enduring, building. Vera opened the tub. He and the state official, whose name Nora still hadn't caught, began the formal cataloging process, which involved a printed manifest and individual document numbers applied with a labeling gun that made a mechanical click each time it fired. The sound was oddly satisfying, the rhythm of evidence becoming official. Farron cleared his throat. "I want to be clear about my role in—" "Mr. Farron," Carver said, without looking at him. "I'll come to you separately." He subsided. Nora's phone buzzed. "Arden. Pruitt left the corridor. She's in her office. Marcus is watching the door." Nora typed back, "Okay." Webb came to stand beside her. Not close, just adjacent, the way people stand when they've ended up on the same side of something and are both watching it resolve. "Holt," he said quietly. "He's in the surgical wing," Nora said. "He's been there since the transport. Orant is going down to him now, with the screenshot." Nora thought about what that conversation would look like. Orant with her reading glasses and her precise questions and the particular forensic patience of someone who had spent her career in medical board investigations, sitting across from a surgeon who had spent 11 years believing that his position at Hargrove was sufficient armor against the consequences of what he'd done. She didn't feel vindicated by the image. She didn't feel much of anything clean about it. What she felt was tired, in the specific way of someone who has been braced for impact for a long time and is only now, with the impact finally arrived, noticing how much the bracing had cost. "The soldier," she said. "Still in surgery. Prognosis improved in the last hour." Webb looked at her sideways. "Arden says he's going to make it." Something in Nora's chest released quietly, like pressure equalizing. "Good," she said. The formal cataloging took 40 minutes. During those 40 minutes, Price sat at the conference table and did not speak and did not look at anything in the room that he could avoid looking at. His attorney made 3 notes on a legal pad and did not share any of them. Farron asked for water and then didn't drink it. The state official photographed 47 documents, logged them in sequence, and stamped each one with a date and a case reference number that Vera read aloud for the recording. When it was done, Carver picked up the folder with Bowen's handwritten account. She read it, not skimming, actually reading, and then looked up at Nora. "This is Gerald Bowen's account," she said. "You asked him to write it. After his second ER visit, I wanted it in his words, not my paraphrase." "Why his handwriting specifically?" "Because I knew that if it was typed, someone could argue it had been edited. Handwriting is harder to dispute." Nora paused. "I also knew it was the kind of account that holds up differently if it's been through a third party. He wrote it himself. He signed it. It's his." Carver held her gaze for a moment. "You've done this kind of documentation before." It wasn't a question in the way Arden's hadn't been a question. Nora answered it the same way, with what was necessary and nothing extra. "I've been trained in evidence preservation," she said. Different context. Carver set the account back in the folder. The OSHA complaint that was pending, the one from the other Vantage worker, has been open for 11 weeks with insufficient corroboration to advance. Bowen's account, combined with your incident reports on the other 3 employees, gives them enough to escalate to a full site inspection. She looked at Price, who was now visibly not looking at any of this. The grant clause that tied Hargrove's operating budget to the absence of this kind of documentation, that clause, under state contract law, constitutes a violation of Montana's patient advocacy statutes. The contract itself becomes the evidence of the scheme. Lowe said carefully, "We'll need to review that characterization before—" "You'll have time to review it," Carver said. "We have time." She said it pleasantly, in the way that contained no pleasantness whatsoever. The conference room door opened. It was Park. She looked at Vera. 2 words, quiet enough that only the immediate vicinity caught them. "Pruitt's leaving." Nora was already moving before Vera had processed it. Not running, but moving with the specific, purposeful speed of someone who knows the geometry of the problem. She went through the conference room door and down the corridor and saw Pruitt at the far end near the stairwell door. Not running either, but moving with the particular urgency of a person who has decided that any exit is better than no exit. "Sandra," Nora said. Pruitt stopped. Not because she wanted to, because something in the way Nora said it was not a call but a fact, and the fact landed before the impulse to ignore it could complete. She turned. Up close, the management architecture of her face had fully come apart. What was underneath it was just a 51-year-old woman who had made a series of decisions over a period of years that had felt, at each individual step, like the reasonable accommodation of an unreasonable situation, and who was only now, in the stairwell corridor of a hospital she had worked in for 19 years, beginning to feel the accumulated weight of what those accommodations had actually been. "I didn't write those complaints," she said. Her voice was careful. "I want you to know that. I submitted them. I didn't write them." Nora looked at her. "I know," she said. "We have the originating user IDs." Something moved through Pruitt's face, relief at being understood, immediately followed by the recognition that being understood was not the same as being excused. "He told me it was a performance matter," she said. "That you were creating liability." "Which reports did he show you when he told you that?" Pruitt blinked. "He didn't show me reports. He said, he told you there was a performance issue and asked you to file the complaints, and you filed them, and you didn't ask to see the underlying documentation." Nora kept her voice even, not cruel, just the shape of it, laid out. "You had 19 years here. You knew how the system worked. You knew that complaints from the charge nurse carry weight." Pruitt's jaw tightened. "I was trying to keep my job." "I know that too." They stood in the corridor for a moment, and Nora felt something that wasn't exactly sympathy and wasn't exactly not. The particular complicated recognition of someone who has been the target of another person's fear and can still distinguish between the person and the mechanism that moved them. "The federal agents are going to want to talk to you," Nora said, "separately from Price. Whether you cooperate or not is your decision, but the user IDs are already on record. The timeline is already documented." She paused. "What you tell them now is the one thing you still have control over." Pruitt looked at her for a long moment. Then she looked down the corridor in the direction of the conference room where Price was still sitting. She turned and walked back toward it. Nora watched her go. Then she walked back too, and the corridor felt different under her feet than it had at the start of the day. Same linoleum, same fluorescent lights, same antiseptic and carpet smell. But the architecture of what it contained had shifted, the way a room feels different when you know what's behind the walls. Holt was brought to a separate room on the 3rd floor at 2:14 p.m. Nora wasn't in that room. She knew about it through Arden, who was in the corridor outside it, and through the sequence of sounds and movements that preceded and followed it. A brief period of what seemed like argument, followed by a longer period of quiet, followed by Orant emerging with her tablet and her reading glasses in her hand and an expression of the flat, forward-looking exhaustion of someone who has confirmed what they expected to confirm and doesn't find it satisfying. She stopped when she saw Nora. "He's going to claim the modification was a documentation correction," she said, "that your original entry was the error." "The patient's own pain reports are in the chart," Nora said. 3 documented verbal reports of 7 or above, initialed by 2 other nurses on the shift. Orant looked at her. "I know. I have them." She put her glasses on her forehead again. "He's going to say it anyway, because at this point, saying it is the only move he has. It won't hold." She paused. "But it means this goes longer than today. The board process is not fast." "I know." "You're prepared for that?" I've been prepared for a long time, Nora said. I just didn't know what I was preparing for. Orant made a sound that was not quite a laugh, but acknowledged the same territory. She went back to her tablet and continued toward the stairwell, and Nora watched her go with the particular respect she had for people who did difficult, undramatic, necessary work without requiring it to be witnessed. The next escalation came at 3:07 p.m., in the form of a phone call to Vera's cell that he took in the corridor with his back turned and his shoulders changing shape as he listened. He turned around after 90 seconds. "Vantage," he said to Okafor. "Their legal team filed an emergency injunction 40 minutes ago to block any regulatory action citing confidential medical records." Okafor looked at Nora. "They know." "Someone told them," she said. "Lo," Webb said from the doorway of the conference room. "He stepped out for 8 minutes when we were cataloging. That's enough time for a call." "The injunction," Vera said, "is based on the claim that the Bowen account and the employee medical records contain protected health information and cannot be used in a regulatory proceeding without patient consent." "Bowen signed the account himself," Nora said immediately. "He consented by writing it and signing it. That's his document, not a hospital record." "Which we will argue," Vera said, "but an emergency injunction creates a delay. The OSHA escalation gets paused while the court addresses the filing." His expression was controlled but tight. "This is a stall. They know the substance doesn't hold. They're buying time." "Time for what?" Arden asked. "To get their documentation in order, to give Price time to build a cooperation narrative that positions him as a witness rather than a subject." Vera looked at the storage tub. If Price flips on Vantage before Vantage fully understands what we have, the calculus of this changes. Nora thought about it for 4 seconds. "The other workers," she said, "the ones besides Bowen. I documented their accounts in the incident reports, but I only got Bowen's written statement. The others, if they gave voluntary statements directly to the labor agent, outside of any medical records context, that's independent of the injunction." Vera looked at her. "Do you have contact information for them?" "Not directly, but their ER admissions are in the hospital record, and the labor agent's investigation." She stopped, looked at Okafor. "Okafor, the labor agent. Where is she?" "Downstairs," he said. "She's been in the billing office for the last 2 hours looking at the grant documentation." "Get her up here," Nora said. "If she's been running this investigation for 9 weeks, she has workers she's already interviewed. She doesn't need the hospital records to corroborate Bowen. She needs Bowen's account to corroborate hers." The piece of it that she hadn't seen until now landed in the room with the clarity of something obvious in retrospect. The labor agent's investigation and Nora's documentation were parallel tracks that neither had known about the other, and the injunction that Vantage had just filed was designed to block the medical records track, the one they knew about. It said nothing about the track they didn't. Okafor was already on his radio. The labor agent came upstairs in 6 minutes. Her name was Torres, mid-30s, sensible shoes, with the specific energy of someone who had been working a case for 2 months in isolation and was experiencing the particular reorientation of learning that they had not been alone. She sat down across from Nora at the small table in the corridor alcove outside the conference room and listened to the explanation of the injunction and the parallel track with the focused attention of someone assembling something in real time. "I have 4 workers on record," she said when Nora finished. "Voluntary recorded statements. Outside of any medical records context, they came to my office. I interviewed them on DOL premises." She paused. "The injunction blocks the use of the Hargrove medical records in a regulatory proceeding. It says nothing about independently sourced worker testimony, which you have." "Which I have." She looked at Vera. "My supervisor authorized escalation to a formal site inspection 6 days ago. I was waiting on one more corroborating source before we moved." She picked up her phone. "I'm calling this in now." She stood and walked to the window at the end of the alcove, and Nora could see her on the phone. The back of her. The posture of someone who has been waiting to make this call and is now making it with the specific satisfaction of a case that has reached its sufficient threshold. From the conference room, through the glass wall, Nora could see Price still at the table. His attorney had his phone out now. 2 federal agents had joined Carver at some point in the last hour. Nora didn't know their names, but their agency credentials were visible from the corridor. The room looked different than it had at the start of the afternoon. It looked like what it was, a room where someone was being systematically shown the structure of what they'd done, piece by piece, in the specific order designed to foreclose the exits. She looked for Farron. He was no longer at the table. She found him through the glass in the corner of the room, not seated, standing with his back slightly to the wall, holding a coffee cup that was clearly empty because he kept looking into it. He had the look of a man who had understood, sometime in the last 2 hours, that the distinction he had been relying on between the person who runs the institution and the person who runs the scheme was not a distinction the law recognized in the way he had assumed. He looked up and saw Nora through the glass. She did not look away. Neither did he. Then he looked down at the empty coffee cup. Arden came back down the corridor at 3:51 p.m. with Marcus the security officer behind her, and the expression on her face had changed from the contained professional focus it had held all day into something more immediate. "The soldier's out of surgery," she said. "Captain Webb is with him." The particular relief of that information arrived in Nora's body before she consciously processed it. A physical thing, a change in the tension she'd been carrying since the moment she'd looked at his chest seal in the trauma bay and understood what it meant. "What's his name?" she asked. She realized she didn't know. She'd stabilized a man for 11 minutes without knowing his name, because in the field, in that specific version of the field, you don't always get names. "Sergeant First Class Patrick Del Rey," Arden said. 29, Fort Callum, 3 overseas rotations. She paused. "He's asking who the civilian nurse was." Nora said nothing. "I told him you'd been suspended and were currently not having a great day," Arden said. He said that sounded familiar. Despite everything, despite the legal framework assembling itself around her, despite the exhaustion, despite the specific weight of a day that had compressed a year of tension into 8 hours, something in Nora's face shifted. "He sounds fine," she said. "He's going to be," Arden said. Marcus, who had been quiet through all of this, said, "Ms. Voss?" He had his hands in his pockets and the look of someone finding words that don't come naturally. "When they took your badge this morning, I want you to know I didn't think—" He stopped. "I should have said something earlier, not just now." "You did what your job required," Nora said. "My job required me to walk you to the door," he said, not to agree with the reason. He looked at her steadily. "There's a difference." She looked at him for a moment. "Yes," she said, "there is." The afternoon moved forward in the specific rhythm of institutional reckoning, not fast, not cinematic, but the grinding procedural advance of documentation and interview and legal response that constitutes how these things actually unfold. Torres's call produced a formal OSHA escalation notice that arrived at Vantage Industrial Solutions' registered address at 4:15 p.m., which Vieira confirmed through a brief call from the DOL regional office. The emergency injunction that Vantage had filed was now, Torres explained, facing the problem of attempting to block regulatory action that was being simultaneously initiated through a track the injunction didn't cover. Vantage's legal team had not known about Torres's investigation. They'd filed an injunction to stop a door they could see. The door they couldn't see had just opened. At 4:40 p.m., Price's attorney requested a recess, which Carver granted for 15 minutes. Price used the recess to sit in the conference room while his attorney made calls in the hallway. And during those 15 minutes, the only person who went into the conference room was Farron. Nora didn't know what was said. She found out later, in pieces, the way you find out things that happen behind closed doors in the aftermath of a crisis, from the shape of what followed rather than the content of what was spoken. What followed was Farron emerging from the conference room after 8 minutes and asking Carver's colleague, the typing man with the state seal, for a separate interview. Price, when he came back to the table, had the look of someone who had just realized that the person sitting closest to him had decided the situation differently. By 5:30 p.m., 3 things had happened in a sequence that Nora tracked through Okafor's periodic updates as she sat in the family consultation room that Webb had cleared that morning. The room that now felt like the operational center of a day that had started with her handing over a badge. Farron had provided a voluntary statement confirming that Price had been the originating author of the administrative campaign against Nora, that he had been told it was a performance matter, and that he had... This was the part that Okafor relayed with the particular precision of someone quoting accurately, not sought independent verification of the underlying performance concerns at any point, which was, in institutional terms, a confession of willful non-inquiry dressed as a passive oversight. Pruitt had provided a statement confirming the complaint submission process and the fact that she had never personally observed the conduct described in the complaints. She had also, unprompted, provided the name of a resident physician who had been pressured 6 months ago to amend a clinical note at Price's request, a note that documented an adverse outcome in a Vantage employee case. The resident physician, a second-year named Dr. Amara Osei, who was currently on a day off in Caldwell, was reached by phone at 5:22 p.m. and agreed to speak with the state medical board representative the following morning. 3 converging lines of evidence from 3 people who had each told themselves they were making a reasonable accommodation, all leading to the same room on the 4th floor of Hargrove Memorial Hospital, and the man who had written complaints under other people's names for 7 months. Nora sat in the family consultation room with a cup of tea that Arden had brought her from somewhere, not coffee, deliberately, because Arden had apparently noticed at some point during the day that Nora had not actually drunk the coffee she'd poured and had drawn the correct inference, and let herself be for the first time in a year without a task that needed doing. It lasted about 6 minutes. Webb came in. He sat across from her without ceremony, not beside her, across, the configuration of someone with something to say rather than something to be present for. "The board wants to meet tomorrow," he said. "Hargrove's Board of Trustees, emergency session." He looked at her steadily. "Carver's team has notified them of the scope of the investigation. The board chair, a woman named Patricia Lund, called the Fort Callum CO directly about 2 hours ago. She wanted to understand the military's involvement." "What did the CO tell her?" "That one of our soldiers is alive in part because of a nurse they tried to walk out the door this morning." He said it without inflection, the way he said most things. Lund then asked whether Ms. Voss's employment situation was something the military had a position on. The CO told her that was a matter for the hospital's discretion, but that any decisions regarding Ms. Voss's employment status should be made with full awareness of her service record. "You're telling me the board is going to offer me my job back?" "I'm telling you the board is going to have a conversation about what this hospital needs now versus what it was trying to manage this morning," Webb said. "Those are different things." Nora wrapped both hands around the teacup. It was a habit she had without knowing when she'd picked it up, holding something warm when she was thinking. "My service record," she said. "How much of it do they have?" "The commendation, the deployment history, the general shape." He paused. "Not Kharif Valley specifically. That's still restricted. It'll come out eventually." "Everything does," he said, "usually at the worst possible moment." He looked at her without apology. "You knew that when you chose to be quiet about it." "I didn't choose to be quiet because I was ashamed of it," she said. "I know. I chose to be quiet because I wanted to see if I could do the job on its own terms, without the background doing the convincing." She looked at the cup. "Turns out I could. The background just couldn't stay quiet while I did it." Webb was silent for a moment. Then, "Delray wants to see you. Tonight, if you're willing, before visiting hours close." She hadn't expected that. She considered it. "Yes," she said. Webb nodded and stood. He was almost to the door when she said, "Captain?" He turned. "The field medic who called in the second medevac at Kharif Valley," she said. "That was Arden." He looked at her, then at the door. Something in his posture shifted. The microscopic recalibration of a man who has just connected 2 things that had been separate and now aren't. "I know," he said after a moment. "Did you know before today?" He held her gaze. "I found out when Okafor briefed me this morning." A pause. "She didn't tell me because she wanted credit. She told me because she thought it explained something about who you were." "It does," Nora said. "Yes," Webb said, "it does." He left, and the family consultation room was quiet again, and outside the window the Montana sky had moved through late afternoon into the beginning of evening, the light going amber, the particular clarity of mountain-adjacent dusk where the shadows extend without obscuring, where everything is visible for a longer moment than anywhere else. Nora finished the tea. At 6:15 p.m., she walked down to the surgical recovery ward and stood in the doorway of Patrick Del Rey's room. He was awake, barely, the specific wakefulness of someone still burning off anesthesia, aware but operating on reduced bandwidth. He had the build she remembered from the trauma bay, diminished by the hospital bed in the way that people who carry themselves one way in the field always look diminished horizontal, and a chest drain that she noted the placement of with the automatic assessment she couldn't switch off. He looked at her from the pillow. "You're the nurse," he said. His voice was rough, slower than it would normally be. "I was," she said. "As of today, I'm not sure what I am." He seemed to find that accurate in some way he didn't articulate. "Arden says you called the chest thing." I identified it. Holt performed the procedure. "Arden says you told Holt what to do." I made a recommendation. He looked at her for a moment with the flat, evaluating gaze of someone whose bullshit tolerance had been reduced to zero by blood loss and anesthesia. "She said you were in the 68th, he said. "For 5 years. "Karif Valley?" "Yes." He closed his eyes for a moment, then opened them. "I did a rotation at Bragg in 2021. 6 weeks." He seemed to be tracking something. "They talked about Karif Valley at the field medicine training, used it as a case study, improvised thoracic intervention under fire, austere conditions." He paused. "They didn't use a name. They usually don't. That was you." She didn't confirm it. She didn't deny it. She stood in the doorway of his room and looked at him. This stranger who was alive because of 11 minutes of work she'd done this morning, and who was now looking at her with the particular recognition of someone connecting a case study to a person. And she felt the specific discomfort of being seen accurately. "You need to rest," she said. "I will." His eyes were already heavier. "What happens to you now?" "Tomorrow the board meets," she said. "We'll see." He made a sound that might have been acknowledgement or might have been the beginning of sleep. She turned to leave. "Voss," he said. She stopped. "Thank you." His voice was almost gone. "For coming back, when they told you to go." She stood in the doorway for a moment with the recovery ward's muted sounds around her. The monitors, the distant movement of the evening nursing shift, the particular quality of a place where people are being kept on the right side of alive. She walked back to the East Wing, back toward where Okafor and Vieira and the documentation were still working through the formal processes that would take days to complete. And on the way her phone rang. Another unknown number, a Caldwell area code, and when she answered it, a man's voice said, "Ms. Voss, this is Dennis Hargis, Hargrove Memorial Board Chair. I believe you may have me confused with Patricia Lund, who called Fort Callum." He corrected himself efficiently. "I'm calling because I'd like to speak with you before the board session tomorrow. Not formally, just to understand where things stand from your perspective." "From my perspective," Nora said. "Yes. Specifically," he paused, and in that pause was the distinct sound of a man choosing his next words with the awareness that they were going to matter. "Specifically, what you think this hospital needs now, given what you know about it." She stopped walking. She was standing in the East Wing corridor, under the fluorescent lights, 11 months of documentation officially entered into evidence, a soldier alive 2 floors above her, and a board chair on the phone asking a question she had never, in 14 months at Hargrove Memorial, been asked. She thought about what she knew about the hospital, about its ER, its clinical culture, its metrics and its staff, and its capacity for both failure and function. She knew it the way you know a place that has been trying to eject you, which is to say, thoroughly, in the places it didn't intend to show. "I have a few thoughts," she said. "I suspected you might," he said. 8 o'clock tomorrow? My office?" She looked down the corridor. At the end of it, through the window, the Montana sky had gone full dark, and the parking lot lights had come on, and in the lot she could see the 2 federal SUVs still parked where they'd been since morning, patient, unhurried, the physical embodiment of a process that moved on its own timeline regardless of what any individual inside this building preferred. 8 o'clock, she said. She ended the call. From around the corner, Okafor appeared with the storage tub in his arms. The physical tub, empty now, its contents officially absorbed into the evidence record. He looked at her face and registered something. "What?" he said. "Board chair wants a conversation tomorrow," she said. "Before the session." Okafor looked at the tub, then at her. "And?" "And Price is still in that conference room with 2 DOJ agents and a lawyer who has been on his phone for the last 4 hours." "Yes." "I want to know what he's saying," she said. "Not officially, just what the posture is. Whether he's building a cooperation narrative or defending the position." Okafor set the tub down. He took out his phone and sent a text to someone she couldn't see. 40 seconds later, his phone buzzed. He read it. His expression didn't change, but something in his stillness changed quality. From operational calm to the specific stillness of someone holding information that has just shifted the weight of the situation. "He's not building a cooperation narrative," Okafor said. "What is he doing?" Okafor looked at her directly. "He filed a counterclaim through Lowe 45 minutes ago. He's alleging that the documentation you maintained off-site constitutes theft of proprietary hospital records, and that your presence in the trauma bay this morning, while suspended, constitutes unauthorized medical practice." He paused. "He's not trying to cooperate. He's going on offense." Nora held his gaze. "He knows the substance is lost," she said. "He's trying to poison the well. If he can make my credibility the issue, make the documentation legally contested, it slows everything down and gives him room to negotiate the terms of whatever comes next." "Yes," Okafor said. "And the board meeting tomorrow becomes complicated if there's active litigation involving the primary witness." She stood in the corridor and felt the specific grinding frustration of a man with nothing left doing the one thing still available to him, reaching backward, trying to catch the person who had already walked past him. Because if he could make her the story, then the story about him had to wait. She had been here before, not in a hospital. In a different kind of building, in a different kind of light, when a different kind of person had tried to make the person reporting the problem into the problem. She had documentation then, too. "The Bowen account," she said. "Is that in the evidence record as his document, his statement voluntarily provided? Or is it in there as something I collected?" Okafor's eyes moved. "It was logged as evidence submitted by you." "It needs to be reclassified," she said immediately. "It's his statement. It was in his possession until I asked him to give it to me, and I have a text from him, from tonight, when I texted him to say the investigation was underway, confirming that he provided it voluntarily and that he retains the right to submit it directly to any regulatory body." She was already reaching for her phone. "If Bowen submits it directly to Torres tonight, if he becomes the submitting party, it's not part of the material Price is contesting." Okafor looked at her for a long moment. "You planned for this?" he said. "No," she said. "I planned for the general case of someone trying to use the records against me. I didn't know the specific form it would take." She was typing as she spoke, a text to Bowen's number, clear and precise. "But when you've been through what I've been through in this place, you stop being surprised by the specific form." Her phone buzzed 30 seconds later. "Tell me what to do and where to send it," Bowen had written. She looked at the message. She thought about Gerald Bowen, the 53-year-old construction worker who had come into her ER twice, who had sat in a curtained bay and told her things about his workplace that he'd never told anyone in an official context because he hadn't known it was an option, who had written 2 pages in careful, uneven handwriting because a nurse had asked him to, and because something about the way she'd asked had made him think it might matter. It had mattered. It was mattering right now in ways he couldn't see yet. She forwarded Torres's direct contact to Bowen with a single line. "She's the labor agent. Call her tonight. Tell her you want to submit your statement directly." She pocketed the phone. "Price's counterclaim goes to court," she said to Okafor. "We let it go. The documentation is in federal evidence custody. The court challenge to it takes time, and in that time the investigation continues through every channel that doesn't require the contested records." She looked at him. The OSE interview tomorrow. Torres's 4 worker statements. Arden's testimony about the transport records discrepancy. Farron's voluntary statement. None of that is in Price's counterclaim. Okafor was quiet for a moment. He made a mistake, he said. He's been making mistakes for 7 months, Nora said. He's just making them faster now. Okafor looked at the empty storage tub on the corridor floor. Then he picked it up, tucked it under his arm, and said, I'll brief Carver. He walked away. Nora stood in the corridor alone for the first time since she'd walked away from the storage unit with the sealed tub in Arden's car. Alone with the fluorescent hum and the faint hospital sounds and the text thread with Gerald Bowen on her phone screen, and the particular understanding that the day was not finished, had not finished the way she'd expected it to finish. Because the man who had tried to erase her had looked at his losing position and decided that making her into a thief and an unauthorized practitioner was more useful than telling the truth. She looked at the corridor, she looked at the window at the end of it, dark now, the parking lot lights making pale circles in the Montana night. She had 8 o'clock tomorrow with the board chair. She had a counterclaim to answer. She had a soldier 2 floors up who was alive because she'd come back to a building that had tried to send her away, and a field medic who had recognized her in a trauma bay, and a sergeant first class who had texted her a warning, and a labor agent who had been working a parallel track for 9 weeks, and a board chair who was asking her what the hospital needed. And she had Harlan Price in the conference room at the end of the hall, who had just given a federal investigation a reason to look at him even harder, who had transformed himself in the last 45 minutes from a subject being investigated into a subject who had tried to intimidate the primary witness, which was not a legal category that improved anyone's position. She understood something then, in the empty corridor, with the clarity that comes at the end of a very long day. Price had not filed that counterclaim because he thought it would work. He had filed it because he needed to believe he still had a move. And the moment she understood that, she understood something else. She had been afraid of this man's institutional power for 7 months. The suspension, the complaints, the careful erosion of her credibility, the way he had managed to make her look like the problem in a building where she was the only person documenting the actual problems. She had been afraid of the power. She had not understood until now that the power was the only thing he had, and that the moment it stopped working, all that was left was a 63-year-old man in a conference room on the wrong side of a federal investigation, filing paperwork out of the last remnant of the reflex that had kept him safe for 2 decades. She picked up her jacket from where she'd left it on the corridor chair. And then her phone rang again. Not Bowen, not the board chair, not any number she recognized. And when she answered it, the voice on the other end was a woman's, and the woman was crying. And through the crying, she said she worked in accounts payable at Hargrove, that she'd been here 12 years, and that she had found something 6 weeks ago that she hadn't known what to do with, and that she'd heard today that federal agents were in the building, and that she needed to talk to someone tonight because she couldn't carry it alone anymore. Tell me what you found, Nora said, and the woman on the phone took a breath and started talking. And what she described in the next 4 minutes was not something Nora had seen in 11 months of documentation, a financial transfer, quarterly, from a Vantage subsidiary to a personal account, routed through a vendor classification that had been set up 4 years ago by someone with system-level access to the hospital's finance module. And the account number she read out slowly because she had written it down and was looking at the paper while she talked, corresponded to a name that Nora had not expected. Not Price, not Farron, not anyone she had been looking at all day. The name on the account was Raymond Holt. Nora stood in the corridor with the phone against her ear and did not move. The woman on the other end, her name was Carol, she'd said that early, Carol from Accounts Payable, 12 years at Hargrove, voice still unsteady, was breathing in the shallow way of someone who had been holding something a long time and had just set it down in a place they weren't sure was safe. How long have you had this? Nora asked. 6 weeks. I found it when I was reconciling the Q2 vendor ledger. The classification didn't match anything in our standard vendor codes. It was labeled as a medical equipment maintenance contract, but there was no corresponding purchase order, no service record, nothing, just the transfers. A pause. Quarterly. 4 years. And you didn't report it. I didn't know who to report it to. Carol's voice tightened. Dr. Holt has been here 11 years. He operates on people. I run expense ledgers. I thought I was misreading it. You weren't, Nora said. She was already walking toward the conference room. Vera came out of it at the same moment, as though the building itself had some awareness of the convergence. He saw her face and stopped. I need 2 minutes, she said. She held out the paper she'd been writing on, the account number, the vendor classification code, the quarterly transfer amounts that Carol had read to her slowly and carefully, because she was the kind of person who, when she finally decided to do something, did it precisely. Accounts payable employee, 12 years here. She found this 6 weeks ago and didn't know where to take it. Vera read it. His face did the thing it had done in the conference room earlier, the controlled stillness of someone absorbing something larger than expected. Holt, he said. She read the account number twice. I verified it against what I know from his HR records. It's a partial match on the routing. Nora kept her voice even. The vendor classification is fake. 4 years, quarterly. Someone with finance module access set it up. Holt doesn't have finance module access. No, she said. But Price does. The corridor was quiet. From inside the conference room, she could hear the low sound of voices. Carver, the typing man, the ongoing machinery of a federal interview that had been running for hours and had just been handed a new direction. Vera looked at the paper again, then at Nora. Where is she now? Car, parking lot. Nora read the phone number she had written below the account details. She said she'll come in if someone official asks her to. She didn't want to walk into the building without knowing it would matter. It matters, Vera said. He was already dialing. Nora stood in the corridor and let the next 20 minutes happen around her the way the whole day had happened. Not to her, not without her, but in the specific collaborative tumble of a situation that had outgrown any one person's management. Carol from Accounts Payable came through the main entrance at 7:12 p.m. with a manila envelope and the expression of someone who had made a decision they couldn't unmake and had decided that was all right. Vera met her at the door. Park walked her to a separate interview room. In the conference room, Carver received the account information through a note Vera passed her. Paper, not spoken. The specific protocol of not alerting the subject to the shape of what was arriving. Nora watched through the glass as Carver read it, set it face down on her stack, and continued her existing line of questioning without a single change in her cadence. That was the thing about people who were very good at their work. They made it look like nothing was happening right up until everything happened at once. At 7:34 p.m., Carver placed the account information in front of Price. He looked at it for 4 seconds. Then he looked at Lowe. Lowe's face had gone the color of the paper. What happened next was not a confession. It was not a dramatic unraveling. It was a lawyer saying, "We need to pause this interview," and a federal agent saying, "Of course," and a 63-year-old man in an expensive shirt sitting very still in a conference room chair, while the specific arithmetic of 22 years of careful, patient, self-protective corruption calculated itself to its final sum in front of him and came up short. He had protected Holt. That was the piece Nora had been missing all day. Not because Holt had leverage over him, but because Holt had been useful. A surgeon who looked clean, who carried institutional credibility, who could be positioned as the face of clinical authority while Price ran the financial architecture behind the wall. The grant from Vantage funded operations. The kickback from Vantage, routed through the fake vendor to Holt's account, bought Holt's cooperation in managing clinical documentation. Price had not been protecting the hospital. He had been running a system, and the system had needed a doctor at its center to stay invisible. Nora understood it the way you understand the complete shape of a thing once you have the last piece, not with surprise, but with the flat recognition of a pattern that was always there, waiting to be seen from the right angle. Holt was placed on immediate administrative suspension at 8:02 p.m. by Orant, acting under emergency authority from the state medical board. He was in the surgical wing when the suspension was delivered, not by Orant alone, but by 2 individuals Nora didn't know, with credentials she could see from the corridor were both state and federal. He came out of the wing without his white coat, which he'd left somewhere inside, and he walked past the nurse's station and the trauma bay and the desk where Nora had worked for 14 months, and he did not look at anyone as he walked. She was standing near the elevator bank when he passed. He looked at her once, Not with hatred, not with the manufactured contempt he'd used in every professional interaction they'd had, just with the expression of a man who had run a calculation for 11 years and had, this morning, encountered a variable that broke it. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. The elevator came. He got in. The doors closed. In the 4 weeks that followed, the structure of what Harlan Price had built came apart in the sequential, documented, publicly recorded way of institutional accountability when the institution has run out of reasons to protect itself. The Vantage contract was terminated by the hospital board in an emergency session that lasted 90 minutes, with 2 board members later telling local press that the termination had been overdue. The OSHA formal inspection at the Vantage site produced 14 violations, 3 of which were classified as willful, the category reserved for employers who knew about a hazard and chose not to correct it. The workers who had been treated at Hargrove with injuries classified as minor, discharged without adequate follow-up, were contacted by the DOL and offered the opportunity to have their cases formally reviewed. 11 of them came forward. Gerald Bowen was the first. Harlan Price resigned under investigation on day 6 before the board could formally remove him. The resignation was presented through Lowe in a letter of 3 sentences that said nothing about what had happened and everything about how long Price had practiced the art of not saying things. Criminal charges for fraud and procurement conspiracy were referred to the U.S. Attorney's Office on day 11. Lowe confirmed through a press statement that his client was cooperating with investigators. The cooperation came, Okafor told Nora later, after the account transfer records were formally subpoenaed, and it became clear that the paper trail was not partial. It was complete, going back 4 years, regular as a heartbeat. Raymond Holt surrendered his medical license voluntarily on day 9, before the board's formal hearing could produce a revocation. The voluntary surrender was characterized in the official record as a recognition that the evidence against him was sufficient to compel revocation regardless, and that the voluntary path allowed him to preserve certain professional designations that a formal revocation would have stripped entirely. His attorney called it a practical decision. Orant, when Nora asked her about it, said that she had seen it before, the calculation of what a person could keep when they could no longer keep everything, and that she did not find it satisfying, but that she found it conclusive, which was what the process required. Sandra Pruitt was not charged criminally. She was terminated from her position for the submission of fraudulent complaints, and a formal finding was entered in her personnel record that her conduct had contributed to a hostile work environment and the suppression of patient safety documentation. She appealed the termination. The appeal was denied in week 3 by a labor board reviewer who read 11 months of time-stamped documentation and concluded in the official finding that the record was unambiguous. Douglas Farron resigned in week 2. He issued a statement that described his tenure at Hargrove as a period of significant challenge and expressed regret for failures of oversight. He did not mention Nora by name, which she noted and then deliberately put down, because she had learned a long time ago that requiring people to name the specific thing they had done to you was a way of making your own resolution dependent on their willingness to give it, and she was not doing that anymore. The board meeting on the morning after, the 8 o'clock meeting with board chair Dennis Hargis, that had happened while federal agents were still completing their preliminary documentation, had lasted 2 hours and 40 minutes. Nora had gone in with no prepared remarks and no list of demands. She had gone in with the same thing she had brought to everything else in the last 14 months, a clear, accurate account of what she had observed, what she had documented, and what she believed the institution required. Hargis had listened, really listened, the kind of listening that doesn't fill the pauses. When she finished, he'd said, "What do you want, Ms. Voss?" Specifically. She had thought about it. "I want the ER to have a clinical compliance function that reports to the board directly," she said, "not to administration. The oversight has to be structurally independent, or it can be managed the same way this was managed." She paused. "I want documentation protocols that protect the people who file safety reports. Automated, time-stamped, independently stored. Not in a system that the chief of operations can access." Another pause. "And I want the staff who were pressured or intimidated during this period to have a path to have their records corrected without having to file individual grievances." Hargis had written all of it down. "And your own position?" he asked. I'd like my badge back, she said. I'd like my personnel file corrected. And I'd like to think about what comes after that, because I've been in survival mode for 14 months, and I'm not going to make a good long-term decision from that position. He had nodded. That's a fair answer. She was reinstated on day 3, badge and all. Marcus was the one who handed it back to her, which was not planned but felt right in the way that some things fall into place without being arranged. She stood in the ER entrance and held it and thought about the morning she had given it up and about everything that had happened in the hours between, and then she clipped it to her scrub pocket and went to work because there were patients and the floor was short-staffed and thinking could happen later. The new position, Director of Emergency Trauma Protocols and Clinical Safety, reporting directly to the board, was offered formally in week 3. She took 4 days to think about it, which she would not have done a month ago. She would have said yes immediately, out of the reflex of proving she deserved it. She took 4 days because she had learned in the specific brutal school of the previous year the difference between earning something and accepting something, and she wanted to accept it on her own terms rather than in the exhale of relief. She said yes on a Thursday, the same day of the week as her suspension. Patrick Delray was discharged on day 8, walking on his own, carefully, with a hand near the doorframe as he turned the corner, but walking. He stopped at the nurse's station on his way out. Arden was with him. He looked at Nora across the station counter with the clear-eyed directness of someone who had regained full processing capacity and was using it. I heard about the new position, he said. Word travels. Arden told me. He glanced at Arden, who was studying the ceiling. She tells me everything, apparently. He looked back at Nora. Sounds right. It's a lot of work, she said. You were already doing it without the title. He adjusted the strap of his bag. That's usually how it goes. He left. Arden followed him out, and at the door she turned back once. Not a wave, just a look. The specific look of someone who had recognized a person across a valley 2 years ago and had spent 2 years making sure it mattered. And then she was gone. And the ER was its ordinary self again, loud and understaffed and full of people who needed things. Webb called on day 22. Not about the investigation. That was finished on his end. His role had been logged, his soldier had recovered, his after-action report had been filed at Fort Callum, and was now the kind of document that gets read by the kind of people who write training cases. He called because, he said, there was a question he hadn't asked. Go ahead, she said. Kharif Valley, he said. The case study they use at field medicine training, the improvised thoracic intervention. You know they've been using it for 3 years. I didn't know that specifically. They never named you because the record was restricted and you'd separated. A pause. Orent's office formally requested your service record as part of the medical board documentation. The restriction was reviewed. Another pause. Your name is going into the case study, Voss, as the attributed medic. He said it with the same even affect he said everything, but underneath it was something that sounded like it had been waiting to be said for a while. I thought you should hear it from someone you know before you read it somewhere. She was sitting at the desk in her new office, a small room off the ER corridor, still mostly bare, a single plant that Arden had left with a note that said, You're going to forget to water this, but try. And she looked at the plant while Webb talked. Okay, she said. That's it? What else should I say? He made a sound, not quite a laugh. Most people say more. I'm not most people, she said. You know that. Yes, he said. I do. She had learned things in the last 14 months that she was still in the process of knowing how to hold. That documentation is not weakness. It is the most radical thing a person in an institution can do because it refuses to let the official version be the only version. That the people who call you disruptive are sometimes the people who need you most and are just too invested in stillness to say so. That being quiet about your own history is not the same as being ashamed of it, but that letting people erase it is not humility. It's just a slower version of the same erasure. She had been trying to prove she could do the job without the background doing the convincing. What she had learned was that the background was the job. Everything she had done in that trauma bay, everything she had built in 11 months of careful documentation, every instinct that had moved her hands before her brain caught up, That was not separate from her years in the 68th Medical Brigade. It was the same thing, wearing different clothes, in a different kind of combat. The woman they had tried to erase had not been erased. She had been, without knowing it, making a record. And the record, in the end, was the only thing that was left when everything else had been stripped away. The record, and the people who had been watching from angles she hadn't known to look for, and the understanding that doing the right thing in an institution that punishes you for it is not a losing position. It is just a long one. She watered the plant. She was probably doing it wrong. She'd never been good with plants, had no instinct for them the way she had for other living things that were more obviously in distress. But she watered it, and she sat at the desk in her new office with the ER sounds coming through the wall, and she thought about Gerald Bowen's handwriting, careful and uneven, on 2 pages that had helped bring down a 22-year scheme. She thought about Carol from Accounts Payable, sitting in her car in the parking lot for 40 minutes before she made the call, 6 weeks of a secret finally outweighing 6 weeks of fear. She thought about Marcus handing back her badge. These were not the dramatic moments. The dramatic moment had been in the trauma bay, and that one was over. What was left, what was always left, after the dramatic moment passed, was the ordinary work of rebuilding something that had been deliberately broken and doing it carefully, with people who were also imperfect and also trying, in an institution that had just learned at significant cost what it loses when it treats the people telling the truth as the problem. She picked up her pen. She had protocols to write, new documentation standards, reporting structures, the specific procedural language that turns intention into architecture. It was not exciting work. It was the kind of work that no one would ever see the full shape of, because if it worked correctly, it would simply prevent things rather than fix them, and prevention doesn't